Okay, this is the lecture that I'm giving on late classical and Hellenistic periods, which will conclude our unit on ancient Greece. So a little bit of history before we start talking about artistic conventions. The last time we talked about Athens, it was sort of going head-to-head against Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars. So they come to an end actually with Athens' defeat. So Athens is defeated by Sparta. Sparta sets up an oppressive pro-Spartan government. However, Athens very quickly rebels against Sparta, reinstates democracy, and their economy sort of begins to recover. So even though Athens never becomes a major political player in the Aegean like it used to be, it will remain a center of art and learning, artistic production, etc. So that's sort of what's happening since we last visited Athens. Significantly, after Athens has sort of reestablished itself, a ruler in Macedonia, so that's over here on the screen, comes into power. His name was Philip II. He conquers Athens and all of the other Greek city-states, and he is assassinated soon after in 340 BCA. His son, whose name is Alexander the Great, maybe you've heard of him, takes over, and he begins to immediately consolidate his power. He sort of gathers all of the Greek city-states under his wing, and he begins an aggressive war, sort of a revenge war against Persia, which is still occupying this area over here. So he leads this revenge war against the Persians, and he wins a massive amount of territory that you can see in purple. He also wins some of ancient Egypt, so ancient Egypt falls to Alexander the Great. They recognize him as a god, and he sort of moves on. He makes it as far east as modern-day Pakistan when his armies just refuse to go any further, and so he decides to turn back. Unfortunately, he dies on the way back to the Mediterranean. He was only 33 when he conquered pretty much, half of the known world. After he dies, unfortunately, Alexander's empire is plunged into chaos. He never named an heir, and he didn't set up any kind of administration to help hold on to the territories that he conquered. So what happens is that local leaders begin to rebel, and the generals of Alexander's army turn on one another, and each of them try to sort of carve out their own territory. That happens in Macedonia and Greece over here with the Antigonids. In Egypt, we have the Ptolemies. The last Ptolemid leader is actually Cleopatra, who you've also probably heard of. And then here in Asia Minor and Turkey, we have Seleucids who are in control. So this is sort of the remnants of Alexander's great army. Eventually, though, all of these three kingdoms will fall to Rome. So this is sort of the beginning of the end for the ancient Greeks. In terms of artistic convention, we have a couple of new things that are going on. All of this begins in the late classical period, and it moves into and through the Hellenistic period. So we have a new architectural order that we'll talk about. It's the Corinthian architectural order. And then sort of more interestingly, I think, we have a little bit of relaxation and experimentation with the classical canon. So a couple of things that we're going to see is that the kind of idea of this generalized ideal figure, so that sort of canon of idealized features that we pointed out at the end of last class, are going to sort of subside, and they will become more particular, more individualized. The sort of decorous or stately kind of drama that happens in classical periods will give way to a much more emotional, dramatic presentation of human emotion. And this all sort of goes hand in hand with this appeal to the senses and emotion that will happen in late classical art. So we will see some of that as we move through. While we're on the topic of Alexander, though, I think it's good to begin with this mosaic. This is a mosaic which we haven't seen before, but it's actually a Roman copy of a Greek painting. So we're studying this as an example of Greek painting, even though it's a Roman copy in mosaic. A couple of things to notice with this one. It's a battle scene. We have Alexander and his army over here, which has been somewhat lost. And then we have Darius III, who is Persian, over here. On this half of the composition. So we have this composition that's sort of divided right around this tree here into these two opposing armies. And I just want you to notice a couple of things about this. One is that we have a growing taste for drama. This is a big battle scene. It's a violent, heroic event. We have kind of diagonal lines that move across the composition and sort of help that movement and drama take place. Notice how Alexander is portrayed as a sort of brave kind of a hero. He's shown here in profile. His hair is kind of blowing in the breeze. He's gazing very steadfastly at his enemy. He's not wearing a helmet. His horse, you can sort of barely make out here, its leg is rearing. So he's portrayed as this big kind of a hero. The Persian leader, on the other hand, is of course wearing a helmet, and he's actually in the process of being defeated and sort of retreating. This is his chariot. This is the horse that's attached to the chariot, and he's being pulled back by his charioteer right here. So he's sort of making this kind of helpless sort of a gesture that again increases the drama here. We have a kind of realistic inclusion of things that you might find on the battlefield, such as discarded weapons or armor. That's an interesting thing, because if you'll remember during the classical period, there was this emphasis on clarity, only reproducing the essential forms that you would need to understand a picture. You don't need these swords in order to know that a battle is taking place, but it seems like they are including them as a nod to kind of realistic, dramatic detail, even at the expense of this classical kind of clarity. So with the human figure, of course, there are a lot of other kinds of changes that are taking place, and one of the best ways I think to see that is to compare our spear bearer over here by Polycletios, who was the guy that kind of invented the classical canon, with a late classical sculpture by a sculptor named Praxiteles, who was a very famous sculptor. His works are known from Roman copies. So just focusing on the image on the right for a moment, this is the Greek messenger god Hermes, and what he's doing, he's a little infant here, the infant Dionysos, who's balanced right here on his arm, and originally his arm would have extended sort of over here, and he was dangling grapes in front of his face, so that part of the sculpture has obviously been lost. A couple of things just to notice formally about the Hermes sculpture before we talk about the relationship between these two. Look at, for example, how much contrast there is with light and dark. That happens in this texture here, up here in the hair also. So lots of very deep carvings that create this contrast between light and dark. And sort of texture of this drapery and the smoothness of Hermes' skin. So just formally we have kind of this emphasis on contrast that's sort of creeping its way in. And we can, I think, actually contrast that to the spear bearer over here, whose hair is really not as deeply carved as all of the curls over here in Hermes, and it doesn't include any of those sort of nicely folded drapery to contrast the smoothness of the skin with that folded fabric. Also notice how the proportions have changed. This is, remember that the spear bearer is made to illustrate Polycletus' canon. Hermes is much slenderer than the spear bearer. His torso and his body just aren't as wide. The musculature has also been toned down. Hermes is clearly a well-muscled, fit guy, but he's neither as cut, and by that I mean, you know, he doesn't have this sort of sharp delineation of muscles. So he's neither as cut nor just as stacked. He's not as bulky as the spear bearer. So that's sort of a convention that is shifting. The ratio of his head to the rest of his body is also smaller. And one of the biggest changes is in the posture of the body. So remember, this is kind of the ideal contrapposto, where we have a balance of tensed and untensed limb. So tensed leg, tensed arm, untensed leg, untensed arm. So that kind of tension and untension is maintained, but look at how far he's leaning over here on the right. So he's really leaning over, and he's unbalanced. He's so unbalanced, in fact, that he needs to sort of lean on this pedestal in order to stay upright. So he's not as kind of self-contained and balanced as the spear bearer is on the left. This characteristic sort of sway that makes it into these late antique and Hellenistic sculptures is called an S-curve. So he has this kind of an S-curve to his posture. The other thing that's different is that we have sort of different expressions. The spear bearer is very sort of calm and placid. Hermes has just a little hint of a smile, I think, as he's interacting with the infant Dionysus. So there's a little bit of an expression change, and also there's a hint at a narrative. So we know that he's playing with this baby over here on the right, whereas the spear bearer is sort of self-contained again in his own little world. There's not a lot of narrative. He's basically presenting his perfect body to you, and you are supposed to admire the proportions in that body. Praxiteles was also active in sculpting the female figure. So here is one of his statues of Aphrodite, of course the goddess of love. She has some of the same kinds of conventional shifts that we just saw in Hermes. She's less balanced than classical sculptures, although she's not sort of ready to topple over. She does have a very pronounced S curve in her body as well, the sort of sway of her hip right here. Contrasts between light and dark, and between fabric and skin, or fabric and hair, are a big part of this piece as well. We also have a hint of a narrative. She has disrobed and she's just ready to sort of enter a bath. This is a sort of large water jug that hints that she's ready to bathe. But the biggest shift in convention, which I'm hoping that you've already identified, is the fact that she's nude. And normally nude females are very much a no-no for classical Greek conventions. So instead of being regarded as kind of a low woman, her nudity does not sort of detract from her nobility in any way. This change could be because Aphrodite is being sort of, at the time that this is produced in the 4th century before the Common Era, she's being sort of conflated and mixed with an ancient Mesopotamian goddess whose name was Ishtar. You remember that name from the Ishtar Gate in Neo-Babylon. So Ishtar was another sort of fertility goddess in the Mesopotamian religion, and she was almost always depicted as nude. So perhaps there's this kind of conflation of these goddesses that happened. The statue itself was really well received. The ancient Greeks, where it was displayed, loved this statue. They actually put it in a special temple to enable it to be viewed from all of the angles, so you could actually walk around it and admire it in the round. And there's even a legend about it that says that Aphrodite herself made a visit to see the statue, and when she saw it, she was so taken aback, she sort of exclaimed in surprise, "How, where, when did Praxiteles see me naked?" So this becomes, because of this shift, this sort of daring new way of representing the goddess, it becomes sort of standard. Moving along to looking at some architecture that happens here, we have the new architectural order. It's called the Corinthian order. You see the name for that right there. And the Corinthian order is very similar to the Ionic order. So this is kind of actually a sort of subversion of the Ionic order. And the main difference that you should know, just to be able to remember it and distinguish it from the Doric and the Ionic architectural orders, is that it has a new kind of capital. So you see the capitals that are crowning these columns here all have this sort of basket-shaped terminal, and then they're covered with leaves. They have these sort of leafy swirls and a couple of volutes that we see sort of left over from the Ionic order. And so the Corinthian architectural order, again, is just characterized by these acanthus capitals. Acanthus is the name of the leaf that is depicted on the top here. This example of a Corinthian order temple is a temple dedicated to Zeus, of course, Zeus, the king of the gods. It was located at the foot of the Acropolis in Athens, and it was actually built over the foundations of an earlier Doric temple. Besides the fact that it is this new Corinthian order, the biggest sort of thing about this temple is that it was absolutely massive. Each of these columns are almost 55.5 feet tall. They're very, very tall. They absolutely dwarf the viewer in comparison to other Greek temples that we've looked at. Even sort of monuments like the Parthenon couldn't compare in scale to the size of this temple. And we were talking a little bit about sort of increased drama that's making it into late classical and Hellenistic art, and I think that this sort of upscaling of the size to really dwarf the visitor to the temple could respond to some of those desires to add drama to these buildings. Other than that, though, in terms of its plan, its layout, and its function, it very much fits in with other Greek temples that we've studied. It had a peristyle kind of colonnade around its perimeter, had an interior cella where the statue of the god was housed. So in every way except for its new Corinthian style and its big sort of size, it's very much like the other temples that we have studied. Other kinds of monuments that we haven't necessarily seen yet, but we're encountering right now, include sort of outdoor altars. So this is an altar that is from the city of Pergamon, which is actually in Turkey, present-day Turkey. So this is from the Hellenistic period. Pergamon was the capital city of the Seleucid kingdom, so one of those three kingdoms that kind of arose after Alexander the Great's death. This one is in Turkey. Pergamon is interesting because it becomes a kind of center for the arts, and it also becomes a kind of hub for a new sculptural style that takes place. We'll look at some of the friezes, one of the images from the frieze of this altar, so one of these images here. But first, I just want to sort of notice, or have you notice with me, just the overwhelming scale of this thing again. So just like the temple to Zeus that we just saw, it's a very, very massive kind of a structure. Staircase was 68 feet wide, 30 feet deep, monumental kind of a thing that was again meant to sort of engulf you. The frieze itself is over 7 feet tall, so these are larger than life sculptures. They depict battles between the sort of Greek gods, and the Titans, or giants. We saw that theme that cropped into the Acropolis, and it still here represents the victory of Greek culture and civilization over outsiders, who the Greeks would call barbarians. In this particular instance, this battle, this sort of mythological, allegorical battle that's taking place, is meant to celebrate a victory over the Gauls, who are a Celtic people living to the north of the kingdom. In addition to just the massive size and dimensions of this building, notice it has lovely Ionic columns with volutes, but also notice how the sculpture here on the stairs like spills out. It sort of takes over, and you have these sort of leaning figures that occupy each end of the stairway. This is part of that drama that characterizes Hellenistic art. And so keep that in mind as we're looking at this particular image here. So we've got Athena, just the iconography of this thing, how it breaks down. We have Athena in the middle. She's fighting a battle against giants and other monsters. We have sort of snake-like monsters that are writhing around in the background, but really the action happens between this figure here, who's a winged god. He's identified by an inscription as a son of the earth goddess Je, who is down here. So she has a hold of him by his hair, and she's pushing him down, sort of forcing him to kneel. His mother, Je, over here on the right, is kind of reaching up, trying to intervene on her son's behalf. We have a winged Nike figure, and she is sort of caught in the act of crowning Athena with a victory wreath. So a couple of things just to notice about this sculpture. Look at how much of the frieze is taken up by the figures. So the figures, again, they occupy and they even sort of break the boundaries of the frieze that they're given. So they spill out into the viewer's space. This is really unlike the calm and orderly processions on the Parthenon frieze. So even when we have like charioteers and horsemen or battles being portrayed in the Parthenon, they don't spill out onto the viewer space. They are left in their own kind of a space. That kind of theatrical and complex interaction between the space where the art happens on the frieze and the viewer's space is kind of a hallmark of Hellenistic or very late classical art. So this interaction between the viewer's space and the space that the art object inhabits, those lines become a little bit more blurred. Notice also we have really dramatic sort of textural difference here. Look at how deeply carved these folds of the garment are, how deeply carved the hair is here. That gives dramatic texture. It gives a dramatic play of light and dark over the surface of the sculpture as well. And finally, this is a wonderful example because we have some expressions here on the characters' faces. Athena's is gone, But this winged creature over here is very much looks, he's suffering, he's in pain. We have a sort of furrowed brow here indicating the concern of his mother over his fate. So emotion is allowed to creep into this work of art. And this is, again, really different from classical arts. Classical art invites your intellectual sort of commitment. It invites you to sort of marvel at the beautiful proportions that are being presented to you in works like the Parthenon and in works like the Spear Bearer. Here, Hellenistic art asks for your emotional investment. So that's a really big difference between the two. That kind of drama here is exemplified, I think, in this image, but I think I'm going to skip it in the interest of time, and we will talk about the Nike, or the victory of Samothrace. She is equally sort of dramatic and theatrical as the sculptures we've been seeing so far. Look at how the wind is kind of whipping her garments behind her. Her wings are outstretched. She's in motion. She's striding forward a little bit. We have that deep carving with textures of light and dark and sort of smooth and rough are being displayed and presented for the viewer. So that also aligns with what we've been saying about the conventions of Hellenistic and late classical art. Originally, this was a figure that was set into a victory monument. It was celebrated a naval victory, and you can see down here this shape is actually the prow of a boat. So it seems like this figure, the Nike figure, has just alighted or descended and landed on this boat. So there's that stone ship that she's landing on. Her forward motion is balanced by the wings that extend out behind her, and even to a certain extent by her sort of whipped up garment here. Notice that she's a little over 8 feet tall, so larger than life, and again, just a dramatic kind of figure in motion. Very theatrical, very Hellenistic. And then finally, even though we've been talking about the changes that have happened in Hellenistic and late classical art, it's important to notice that not everything changes. In fact, we have some sculptors like Alexandros from Antioch, whose work, The Venus of Milo, which you see on the left, very much looks toward late classical sculptures like Praxiteles. So we have, at the same time that there's this sort of new kind of sculpture that's being, or new kind of aesthetic that's being developed, we have more conservative workshops again that are still creating works that look backward to the sort of classical values. Here, the artist, I think, is very clearly looking at the Praxiteles' Aphrodite over on the right. She's even a little bit more conservative because she's wearing a garment from the waist down. It's sort of slipping off of her body, but again, she is more covered than the Aphrodite on the right. Her face is sort of contemplative. It really contrasts with the sort of emotion-filled faces that we've been seeing before. But at the same time, some of those Hellenistic aspects are maintained, such as the very deep carving of the garments here, and that contrast between texture and light and dark.